Welcome into Words with Wallace. I am your host, Nick Wallace. Is it just me, or is that intro music hitting diffy today? We're coming at you. It is Monday evening, March 27th. Actually recording this while some of the games are currently going on. We have a really exciting episode for you today. So we're going to be focused on what I like to call the NBA pressure pyramid. I know, super creative, right? We love alliteration here on the podcast. And what this really means is we're going to be focusing on, we're about 2 weeks away from the end of the regular season here and the start of the NBA playoffs. And I feel like it's a really good time to look at and analyze, what NBA teams actually have the most pressure on them heading into the playoffs. So this is really crunch time. I've been saying that for weeks, but now I really mean it. So it's going to be fun to really focus on some of the narrative, some of the history with these, contending teams and maybe not contending teams. We'll see. And really focus on everything, why the end of this regular season and playoffs is so important for these teams and what are the top 5 NBA teams with the most pressure on them. Again, heading into the NBA playoffs. But before we get into that, I just wanted to take a quick look around the NBA. We had a pretty fun week of basketball. I think, it was highlighted by the return of many star players, the return of LeBron James, Karl Anthony Towns, Ja Morant, lesser named players, Rob Williams and Gary Payton II. All those guys coming back from extended absences, we'll say, for different reasons, not all injury-based, as we know with Ja Morant. But I couldn't help but identify a bit of a trend that we're setting with the pod. It's a bit concerning, right? So, we had RJ on earlier in the month, and, within a week of that podcast being posted, we focused on the Boston Celtics, of course, in that podcast, the Celtics Vibe Check. And within a week of that podcast being posted, the Celtics suffered probably their worst loss of the season to the last place and worst record in the entire league, Houston Rockets. And it really was kind of a loss that came out of nowhere, and it was really panic-inducing for a lot of Celtics fans out there. And if you thought that was bad, well, last week, as you probably saw, we had Ian Kayanja of A to Z Sports on to talk about the Dallas Mavericks. We did a Dallas deep dive. Definitely encourage you to check out that episode if you haven't already. And that was a lot of fun where we talked at length about the Mavericks. But even though we dedicated a full episode to them last week, I need to talk about them because they had one of the worst weeks in franchise history, I would argue. I know that sounds dramatic, but I truly mean it. They went on, as soon as that podcast was posted, their next 4 games, they lost them all. One was to Golden State, another was to Memphis, and the last 2 were to the Charlotte Hornets, a roughly, 20 or 15 win team that's at, last place or second to last place in the Eastern Conference. And not only that, the first game that they lost to Charlotte was missing their 3 leading scorers, arguably their 3 best players in LaMelo Ball, Terry Rozier, and Kelly Oubre. Maybe not 3 best players. Hayward's pretty good too. But certainly their 3 leading scorers. And the Hornets were on a second night of a back-to-back, and the game was in Dallas. And the Mavericks really, really need to win. I think that's the part that can't be overstated. The Mavericks are at full health. The Hornets are banged up as shit, playing in Dallas on the second night of a back-to-back, and Dallas drops that game. And just to remind you, the Mavericks are, if the season started, or the playoffs started today, Dallas would be an 11 seed. Dallas would not even be in the play-in game. And of course, as I might remind you, the 4 seed in the Western Conference all the way down to the 12, it's still only separated by 3.5 games. So all these games are really, really important, especially for the Mavericks. So this is a really bad loss. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on Dallas, but I had to talk about it because, as I mentioned with Ian, the primary focus, for this Mavericks team should be keeping Luka Doncic, happy at all times. And for them to drop even that first game to Charlotte, he actually had a quote after that first Charlotte game, and I want to read to you guys real quick. Again, this is Luka Doncic. "Sometimes I don't feel it's me. I'm just being out there. I used to really have fun, smiling on the court. But it's just been so frustrating for a lot of reasons, not just basketball." Luka went on to elaborate that, he was dealing with some off-the-court stuff, which we certainly wish him the best with. He didn't elaborate on that much. It seemed like it might be some family-based issues, but that doesn't sound like a happy superstar to me, right? I think that alone raises an area of concern. And I don't want to spoil too much of what I talked about with Ian, but he was really, really low on Jason Kidd and his outlook as a head coach in this league, and if he's even fit to be that. And I don't think that there's more of a coaching red flag than what we saw, because Dallas had the rare opportunity to bounce back after that loss to their first loss to Charlotte, right? The next game on their schedule is a game in Charlotte, so the Hornets are home. They got back Terry Rozier for what that's worth, and they lost again. This game was slightly closer, but again, the Mavericks at full strength. The fact that the Mavericks had this opportunity to bounce back and play Charlotte a couple games later, I feel like above all else, that falls on your head coach, right? If you're the head coach of that team and you don't have the ability to get your guys up for a revenge game against a bottom barrel team when you are at full strength, I don't know, man. I don't see how Jason Kidd makes it through if things continue like this for Dallas, because it is really that bad. And I think the most interesting wrinkle about all this, and again, we'll put a bow on this Dallas situation in a second, they still have basically one piece left of the Kristaps Porzingis trade from a couple years back. For them trading for Kristaps Porzingis, they acquired him from the New York Knicks. And there's a first-round pick that still needs to be paid out to the New York Knicks. But the issue with that is that it's actually top 10 protected, meaning if the Mavericks land a top 10 pick in the NBA draft for this season, the Mavericks actually get to keep that pick. And so I guess the only thing I would say is that there is some sort of silver lining for Dallas, where if they actually continue to bottom out and that pick ends up being, and now there's a lottery system and we mostly understand that, I would imagine. So whether they make the playoffs or excuse me, if they miss the playoffs, there's not even a chance that there's a chance that pick still might not convey. But I guess that is a silver lining for the Mavericks, is that you might be able to take away a top 10 overall pick that you weren't expecting to have this season, because I would imagine most people would have just assumed that pick was going to New York. There's no chance that the Mavericks land in the top 10 for this current year's draft, and unless there's some crazy injury to Luka. But he's been relatively healthy, and it really is that bad for Dallas. Now, if you're a Mavs fan, you still obviously want them to turn this thing around and win out the rest of their games. I don't even think that they can make it up to the 6th seed at this point. They'd have to be, overjoyed with even just a play-in appearance at this point. And again, I actually did see some stuff circulating around if you're the Mavericks, do you just, kind of continue on this route? Do you bottom out? Do you focus on trying to acquire that top 10 draft pick? You don't do that, because again, like I've been saying, Luke is already pretty unhappy. I can't imagine the embarrassment that a guy that competitive would be faced with if they were to not even make a play-in tournament. So again, just being a top 10 seed in a 15-team conference, if they can't be in the top 2/3 of their conference, the embarrassment that's going to mean for Luka is immense. And on top of that, as much as it sucks, this really isn't Kyrie's fault. He's been playing pretty well. Again, I don't like the deal, and I just don't feel like this necessarily falls on the shoulders of his play. However, you still need to actually really keep that guy happy as well, because you can't afford to have him screw you over and leave in the offseason. So things are really bad in Dallas. They are infinitely worse than where we were even a week ago. Just to be totally transparent, they did already, I'm recording this after their game to the Pacers. That was, again, on the 27th here today. They did beat the Pacers for what that's worth. So, again, another bottom barrel team that is not even in the play-in tournament in the Eastern Conference that, hey, at least they were able to rebound a little bit against that. Luka actually threw probably the best pass I've ever seen in my entire life. So let's move on to, now that that's out of the way, now that we got a quick victory lap on Dallas out of the way, let's move on to our NBA pressure pyramid. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of actually ranking the top 5 teams, I wanted to kind of include a category of the non-contenders with a lot of pressure on them. And I feel like one of the two teams that jumped out that I'd be remiss to not mention is the Minnesota Timberwolves. So, and really this one's simple. I'll try to keep this brief. As we all know, it comes down to the fact that the Timberwolves mortgaged their entire future and traded roughly $1 billion draft picks for Rudy Gobert in this past offseason. And essentially that's left them at a point where, they're fighting, they're in that play-in contention race. The good news for them is that they did just get Karl Anthony Towns back, like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, and they're 2-0 with Karl Anthony Towns, which is pretty exciting. I'm actually excited to jump off this podcast in a little bit because I want to watch them play the Sacramento Kings tonight, which should be a really fun game. But again, there's just so much pressure on them that they made the decision that, they kind of went all in, if you will. They traded away so many draft picks. They traded away a few young players, and Walker Kessler, who they just drafted, Jared Vanderbilt, who again has already bounced around a couple times and ended up on the Lakers. Those guys are really young and really talented, and again, I think that if they could just undo that trade and just get back Walker Kessler on its own, I think Minnesota would do that. But again, there's a lot of pressure on them to be competitive for how much they paid in the offseason. So they need to make the playoffs. That is like their pressure barometer, if you will. And that's something that I'll come back to. Like, what is the bare minimum for this team to meet their expectations and avoid the disaster coming their way if they don't live up to this pressure that's been put upon them? And I think for the Timberwolves, it's very simple. They need to make the playoffs. They're probably not going to make it up to that. I guess they could make it up to the 6th seed looking at the standings now. But I do think that they will likely end up in the play-in game. And if they do, they need to make sure they win at least one of those play-in games to secure a spot in the playoffs. The next team that I wanted to just kind of highlight for a quick second is the Toronto Raptors, because they're a team that was kind of at a crossroads. We talked about them, obviously last time on the tier ranking pod, which was about a month ago now. But essentially, the Raptors have been roughly a 500 team all year. They had a little bit higher expectations before this past season, and they've fallen short of virtually all of those expectations. And so they had an opportunity at the trade deadline to evaluate where their team was at and decide which direction that they wanted to go. OG Anunoby, a name we've mentioned here on the pod before, was thrown into all sorts of different trade rumors, mainly just because he's an awesome asset. He's 25 years old. He's a perfect 3-and-D option. He's a really versatile defender. Fred VanVleet was featured as a trade target for a couple teams that were point guard needy as well. And, Toronto essentially made the decision to not make a move. They decided to I shouldn't say that. They made the decision to not only stand pat, but they actually wanted to reinforce, their chances of competing this year. Now, again, I don't think Toronto thought that they were going to win the championship after their trade deadline, but they did make a competitive move, and that move was trading with the San Antonio Spurs for Jakob Poeltl, weird name, I know, and to give up in that trade, it wasn't like they paid a ton for Jakob Poeltl, but they gave up a decent amount. I mean, they traded Khem Birch, who was a backup center for them, and they traded away a first-round pick in 2 seconds for Jakob Poeltl. And so, and give to their credit, he's been pretty great for the Raptors. Since acquiring him in that deal, they've been 11-8, which is, slightly better than what they were previously. Poeltl's been fantastic. He's really been a missing piece. If you watch the team at all, they were really short on traditional big men, and he's unlocked a lot of things for them. He's averaging 15 and 10. So I like the deal on the surface, but I just don't think it's resulted in enough, wins for them. They're currently sitting at the 9 seed in the Eastern Conference, and I think, they're bottom line, what they need to hit is, again, just like the Timberwolves, they need to make the playoffs. They're currently sitting at the 9 seeds. They, if the season ended today, they would essentially have to win 2 different play-in games just to make the actual playoffs. And I think that they need to get that done. And, that's easier said than done, especially in the East. Like, you're matched up with, Miami's in that range, Atlanta's in that range. Chicago's been really frisky of late, and they're in that range. But I do think that, if you're the Raptors and you have a solid roster, you have Fred VanVleet, you have OG Anunoby, you have Pascal Siakam, you have Jakob Poeltl, and you have allegedly a pretty good coach in Nick Nurse that, is really just focused on, he's not really developing a bunch of guys off the bench. He's just focused on playing his starters, 35 minutes a game. I expect them to come out of the, not come out of the East, but come out of the play-in tournament in the Eastern Conference. And so I think that they have a more pressure on them than you might think. So I want to get into an honorable mention before we get into the top 5, because this was really tough for me. I think it came down to 6 teams that had, jumped out by facing more pressure than the rest of the group. So it was kind of tough deciding where I wanted to make the cut. So this is going to be an honorable mention outside of the actual pyramid itself, and this is going to be none other than the Memphis Grizzlies. And I think what's so funny about the Grizzlies is I think a lot of this pressure is self-induced, and we'll get into that in a second. Let's quickly take a look at where the Grizzlies are at. Ja just came back. He looks great, to nobody's surprise. Physically, he's the same guy. He didn't suffer an injury. It was obviously some mental health stuff that he was going through, and we're happy to have him back. So, of course, he looks fine. That being said, they surpassed Sacramento. Sacramento's been on a bit of a slide recently, and Sacramento had the 2 seed for a little bit there. Well, now it's Memphis again, and just to kind of look at where they've been, right? I mean, they jumped on the scene, as more of a competitive team about 2 years ago. That year, that season, they ended up losing to Utah in the first round of the playoffs, which was reasonable. I think that season overall was a success. Taking a closer look at last year, right? Like, again, they won in the first round against Minnesota, but I think that was definitely a 2-7 matchup that could have gone either way. If you watch that series at all, you know that Minnesota was basically up by double digits in virtually every game in that series, and I felt like just by watching that series, it was more of Minnesota finding ways to lose rather than Memphis finding ways to win. And so, that's just something to keep in mind. But they ended up losing to Golden State in 6 games. And, that's a team that was the best team in all of basketball last season. So there's really no shame in that. But this season in particular, I think, we've touched on it a little bit. But earlier in the season, Ja Morant had, an interview with Taylor Rooks where he said, and I quote, "I'm fine in the West," basically suggesting that the only team in the entire league that he was worried about was the Celtics. Basically, they're mentally penciling themselves in for a finals appearance, and that got overplayed quite a bit. And then, of course, I don't think Ja helped his case by being caught up in some of the controversy that he's been involved with recently that I don't want to get into too much. But in general, I just feel like they have done a really great job at putting a target on their back this season. Like, they went to more of like, on the national level, a young, likable, exciting team. And they're still, an exciting team. They're still very fun to watch, but throughout everything they've been involved with and all the shit that Dylan Brooks gets into, they've definitely put a target on their back. Teams don't take them lightly like they did last season. And so, for them, I think that they still have a little bit of a grace period because they are so young and so many people still do like Ja. Their bottom line is they better win one round. They better win one round or else it's going to get ugly. And I do think that they are an upset alert team depending on, if Golden State ends up in that 7th seed, if the Clippers end up in that 7th seed and match up with Memphis in the first round. I don't know if I would take Memphis in that matchup, but, Grizzlies fans, they better hope that they win one game out there. Or one round out there, rather. Moving on to the base of the pyramid. And at my number 5 spot for, top 5, again, most pressure on them heading into the end of this season, I have the Los Angeles Clippers. Now, when I originally got the idea of kind of doing this segment, I was picturing the Clippers to be pretty high on this list because it certainly was feeling like a now or never season. And the unfortunate news, recent news for the Clippers anyway, is that, Paul George suffered a knee injury earlier this week. He's likely to be out 2 to 3 weeks, which would put him, at best case scenario, around the first round of the playoffs. So we'll see, that it certainly looked a lot worse than a 2 to 3 week injury. I'm certainly no doctor, but it was pretty gnarly to watch. That being said, it's hard to give them another injury pass because I wanted to, again, I think the pressure that stems with these teams, you have to look at their last couple years of playoff success and kind of analyze where they are. So just as a reminder of what the Clippers have looked like the past couple years, the 2019 offseason is where they made their big splash, right? They traded, or they signed Kyrie, they signed Kawhi Leonard and they traded for Paul George. After that point, they, with this roughly current roster construction is kind of the period I want to evaluate them on. We have a decent sample size here. So the first season that they had both of those guys was the bubble season. They were, the 2 seed that season. Again, the 2020 season, the bubble season. They were a 3 seed and they lost to the Nuggets in 7 games and kind of under the radar blew a 3-1 lead. Like, I know that was talked about a little bit at the time, but it was a bubble, so people kind of gave them a break for that. So whatever. But they were healthy. That's the important thing. And they ended up blowing, a series to Denver in 7 games. The following season, the 2021 season, they were the 4 seed. They lost to the Suns in the Western Conference Final. Again, they kind of got a pass for that because Kawhi, tore his ACL in round 2 against the Jazz, and the Clippers were short-staffed, and they were facing a really good Phoenix team that obviously ended up making it to the finals and nearly winning the whole thing. So, something to keep in mind. The next season, which was that was last season. They were the 8 seed. They had no Kawhi virtually all season. Paul George only played in 31 games, and they lost 2 consecutive play-in games and didn't even make the overall playoffs. So again, in the play-in tournament, not in the playoffs. So where does that leave us now? So obviously you have a pretty spotty record here where, again, just to summarize, they made it to round 2, then they lost to the Suns in the Western Conference Finals, and then they didn't even make the playoffs last year. And I feel like now is really where the pressure is starting to build, because what I didn't really talk about is that, again, before all of those seasons that I just mentioned, they were, very highly ranked, widely considered across the NBA as contenders. And, we certainly haven't seen them get all that close. Again, most of that comes down to injury, but I feel like this is where, the patience is starting to wear thin. If you're Steve Ballmer, owner of the Clippers, if you're, a true Clippers fan, I know there's not that many of them out there. I feel like what's really kind of building the pressure is the Paul George trade, right? Like, that's a deal that, in the moment, you don't really give him much slack for, because it was a deal that, again, Kawhi wanted to play with Paul George, and they felt like it was a deal that they had to do in order to get, sign Kawhi, who, again, this was Kawhi coming off a title. He was at the peak of his powers. And, it's a deal that you do. You paid over the moon. And this was like the first major, like, holy crap, like, superstar trade that we saw, where they basically traded for, they traded away Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and a shitload of first-round picks, and they brought back Paul George. Now it's starting to get really bad in terms of how that trade looks, because, again, Paul George's health record has been spotty, and it's continued that way this year. But, Shai's made the leap. I talked about Shai a little bit last week, but, the guy's averaging over 30 points per game. He's, looking at likely a first or second team All-NBA season. If not, he'll be on an All-NBA team. That much is for sure. And one of those first-round picks turned into Jalen Williams, a.k.a. J-Dub. I know there's two Jalen Williams in the Thunder, but the better Jalen Williams that's currently second in Rookie of the Year race. And on top of that, they also got Terrence Mann in that deal. There's still, 3 first-round picks left to be paid out in that deal, and a first-round pick swap. So again, Paul George for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Jalen Williams, Terrence Mann, 3 more first-round picks, and a pick swap left. Yikes. If they don't end up at least making it to an NBA Finals at some point with the current construction of this team, it's already really bad, but it's just going to really solidify how much of a joke and how much of the little brother that the Clippers are, because they truly have had a talented team the past couple years. And for them to not get it done, that's really bad. And so, again, I dropped them down to number 5 on this list. I had them a lot higher, but now with the Paul George injury, it's like, are they going to get a pass again? I don't know. But I still think that with how this team is constructed, their bottom line is they need to beat anybody in the Western Conference that's not Denver or Phoenix, is kind of where I like to, put the bottom line for the Clippers. Moving on to the number 4 team on this list, a team near and dear to my heart. This is where I put in the Boston Celtics. And so let me just take a quick look at where we're at, legacy-wise. This is like a fun, little brag for Celtics fans. We've only missed the playoffs 1 time since winning the title in 2008. That's just a kind of a fun fact. So we've certainly had a lot of success. We haven't got over the hump. We haven't won the finals, obviously, since 2008. But we have had a lot of playoff success, and, you can still fall back on the fact that, both of our superstars are relatively young, and, we're really well coached, and we have a rookie, or not well coached, we have a rookie head coach anyways. And so there's a lot of time for this team to develop and yada, yada, yada. I still think that there's they are number 4 on this list. I still think there's a lot of pressure on them. And I think a lot of that pressure, we've seen Celtics, make a lot of national headlines this week, or certainly in NBA media circles, because there's been a lot of talk around Jaylen Brown. If you guys didn't see, Jaylen Brown did a little bit of press this week, or at least there were a couple stories about Jaylen Brown that came out. One of them was written by Sopan Depp. I hope I'm getting that name right, with the New York Times. I think the highlight of that piece for Celtics fans is that, or the low light rather, is that Jaylen, sort of condemned the Boston fans and saying there was a nasty subsection of Boston fans that he didn't appreciate, among some other things, which I think is fair criticism. And I think that, while that's true, you could also say that about nearly every other NBA fan base. But, understood. We hear you, Jaylen. And then Logan Murdoch of The Ringer posted a very long piece kind of looking at, Jaylen Brown's career over the past couple years, and really his entire career since being in the NBA, and highlighted, I think the low light of that piece in particular was, how the Celtics handled this past offseason, and, essentially his name being floated in Kevin Durant trade rumors. And those rumors were really never refuted by the organization, by the Celtics organization, as far as I know. And so I think that, there was some, aggregation of those pieces that came out that would suggest that Jaylen Brown isn't happy with the Celtics, and there's tension there and this and that. I read both of those pieces. I looked through them. I think both of the pieces were pretty great and worth the read if you're a Celtics fan. That being said, my level of concern with Jaylen Brown is probably like a 3 out of 10. Like, I don't think that those pieces really told me anything I wouldn't guess. I think the big takeaway is just that, like, yeah, you're right. The Celtics probably mishandled that Durant situation, and they probably could have came out and refuted some claims, and even if that was a lie, they could have at least done some positive PR to do that. But I think that came down to the front office having, more fires to put out, dealing with the Ime Udoka situation, the head coaching situation, rather than being worried about Jaylen Brown's feelings and all that, which, you can say that's an excuse and whatever, but I think that was kind of what they were dealing with at that time. So, that being said, let's kind of zoom back in on this season, right? The Celtics are the 2 seed. They've kind of steadied the ship a little bit. They had a rocky, early March, as we kind of talked about, but they've had some, good wins lately, mostly against easy teams. I think the most notable win they've had was against Sacramento, which was a really great road win for them. But, the part about Jaylen Brown that I am concerned with is, the fact that, all these negative media headlines are combined with the fact that his contract situation is a little rocky. He's under contract for obviously this season and then next season, but as currently constructed, he would be an unrestricted free agent after next season. And from what I've been, told and what I've heard anyway, rather, is that he's really unlikely to sign an extension before that, basically because, it's not maximizing his income, because we got him on a really, cheap contract for how talented of a player he is. He's clearly a max contract player. I don't think there's many people debating that. But essentially, if he were to sign an extension, it would be based off of, the current contract we have him on, which is obviously not max money. And so, you could argue that, he just wants to maximize his income, which is very fair. Or you could say he's not going to sign an extension because of all the things that came out in those pieces that we just talked about. I'm sitting here just hoping, praying to God he makes an All-NBA team, which I haven't really taken a super close look at, but I'm sure he has a chance at doing this season. And I think if he makes an All-NBA team either this season or next season, that would make him eligible for a Supermax extension, which the Celtics would be idiots not to do. He's clearly worth that money. And so I think that, that would make it so that the ball's kind of back in the Celtics court where, he would really have to be unhappy here to turn down Supermax money. I cannot imagine he would ever do that. And so hopefully him making an All-NBA team can kind of right the ship on that. So that's my feelings on the Jaylen piece. But, I think my overall outlook on the team hasn't changed. It's certainly been reassuring the past couple weeks, like we said, getting Rob back, steadying the ship a little bit. I feel like the same spot as I did during the tier rankings. I think a loss to any team that is not the Milwaukee Bucks is a total disappointment of the season. Hopefully the Celtics stay at the 2 seed so they can at least make it to the Eastern Conference Finals before they see the Bucks, and hopefully the standings stay that way. I think that they will. And if they lose to the Bucks and you lose to Giannis, I can sleep easy as a Celtics fan depending on how it plays out. But I do think that the team as a whole, could go the distance. I think they're, up there as my pick, or maybe, secondary choice to win the whole thing behind Milwaukee. I think they're that good of a team. And so hopefully they meet those expectations and don't lose to a team like Philadelphia or somebody else in the Eastern Conference. Moving on to our number 3 team on the list. This is where I had the Phoenix Suns. Now, we've obviously talked about it a bit on this podcast, how the Phoenix Suns, essentially stole the trade deadline in terms of media attention and whatnot by trading away Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson and basically a crap load of picks for Kevin Durant. And that certainly puts them, I would say, saved any chance that they had this season of being competitive. But the issue is that, Kevin Durant got hurt again. He's only played a handful of games for the Suns, and they really expect him back relatively soon, hopefully with a few games left in the regular season to get some continuity heading into the playoffs. But, I think that this is, the Suns have an older team. That's no secret. That they have a really bad health bet team. Again, that's no secret. But I do think that there's still a lot of pressure for them to compete this season and at least make it to the Western Conference Finals. Looking back on them the past couple years, they made their big splash and their big leap from being a pretty mediocre team with really just Devin Booker and some young players in the 2020 offseason where they traded for Chris Paul. They acquired Chris Paul from Oklahoma City. And in that first season, they were really successful. They were dominant during the regular season and ultimately lost to the Bucks in the finals. I don't think there's much shame in that. I think the better team won that year. I do think the finals could have gone either way, but I don't think you're too upset with losing to the Bucks in the NBA Finals, where I don't even remember their last finals appearance before that. So that was certainly a great way to jump upon the scene. Last year, I think, is where things certainly took a turn for the worst. If you are kind of zooming out, you'd be like, oh, well, they lost in the Western Conference Finals. That's not that bad. Well, you have to remember that they lost in, basically one of the worst playoff meltdowns I've ever seen. They lost to, certainly, I would argue, an inferior Mavs team. And they did it in really embarrassing fashion. The Game 7 was in Phoenix. They were, like I said, obviously they have the home court advantage. And they totally melted down in that Game 7. It was a complete blowout, despite it being a pretty competitive series before that. It was a total blowout where I think Luka outscored the Suns in the first half of that Game 7. Like, he outscored the entire Suns team himself in the first half, and I think it ended up being like a 30 or 40-point game. Like, that's how bad it was. It was terrible. And that's a really, really scarring loss. It almost doesn't even matter at that point that it's the Western Conference Finals when you lose to an inferior team in that embarrassing of a fashion. And obviously this season they recognized that, things weren't going well this season. I think when they acquired Durant, they were, roughly, around the 6 or like the 8 seed or something like that at that time. And so I think, again, credit to their front office for realizing that, this team as currently constructed before the trade deadline wasn't going to get it done. And so, they acquire Kevin Durant. Now, initially you would think like, okay, they obviously traded a bunch of first-round picks and they traded away some relatively young guys in Bridges and Johnson. And so you'd think that they shortened their window. I don't necessarily know if that's true. I'm a big Kevin Durant guy, and he's under contract for like 4 more seasons. So, I think he's going to age well. I think he still has a lot of years left of being an elite NBA player. The issue is just, how many games are you going to be getting him for that season? And is his health going to align with all the other factors that it takes to being a good team? Really the concern comes down to Chris Paul because, again, as I just said, I think if Durant's healthy, he's going to be fine for the next couple of seasons. Booker's up after next season, I think, but they'll be able to go over the cap to sign him. He's made an All-NBA team, and he probably will again this season. So they shouldn't have any problem giving him a supermax, to my knowledge. But basically, they worked out the Ayton thing last offseason, and I think that's kind of like their core right there between, Booker, Ayton, and Durant. The issue is that you have Chris Paul. Now, they're going to have him under contract, but, he's 37 right now, 36 or 37, and, he looks it. Again, his health is up and down. His, playoff shortcomings are really well documented. You really can't trust that you're going to get another season. And again, he's obviously took a step back this season. I think he's just going to continue to take steps back. I really like, Phoenix is currently constructed, but I just don't know how you expect to get back to this point when, Chris Paul is still one of your 3 or 4 most important players. Hopefully having Durant, lightens the burden for him offensively even more, but they are definitely going to need to address the point guard position and get him maybe a better backup than Campaign in the offseason, regardless of what happens. But again, I mean, they pushed all their chips into the middle of the table. Again, this is self-induced pressure. I think they made the right move for trading for Kevin Durant, but even though that this is, you could be like, oh, well, this is the first year we have Durant and, we haven't played that many games together as a team. When you make a move like that and you mortgage that many picks, you have to take advantage of the fact that even though you're a little bit banged up, most of the Western Conference is really banged up too. And so for Phoenix, I think their bottom line, like I said before, you need to make the Western Conference Finals or the season is a bust. I think it comes down to that. If you lose to Denver, maybe that's all right. But, if you get Kevin Durant back for the playoffs, you better at least make it to the Western Conference Finals. Moving on to my number 2 team, the second most pressure in the entire NBA heading into the playoffs. This was really close. My top 2 teams were really close. And so I ultimately landed on the Philadelphia 76ers in the number 2 spot. Philly, I would argue, has the longest, recent record of playoff shortcomings that are really bad and embarrassing, I would argue. Again, I think it's important to look back on what these teams have done in recent years to kind of see how this pressure is mounting. I'm just going to kind of start off this recent history at the 17-18 season, but you have to keep in mind that there was a solid 5 to 6 years of tanking before that, where, again, that was the process. That was, the process that acquired them Joel Embiid and the process that got them Ben Simmons and, Markelle Fultz and Jahlil Okafor, all those other lottery picks that they had, and, they hit on half of them and whatever. There was a lot of grinding to get to them to the point where they're even semi-competitive. But they've really never made it far in the playoffs. And a lot of people know that, but, it only stacks, it only builds. And so, in 17-18, that was kind of, I want to say, the first full season that Ben Simmons played. They lost in the second round to the Celtics. The following season, they actually made it on to round 2 in the Eastern playoffs. And that's the farthest that they've made it. That's the farthest they've made it with this team as currently constructed. And they lost in the second round to the Raptors. Now, that was an incredible series. That was a series that went 7 games. That was the Raptors championship season. And, of course, that was the Kawhi Leonard Game 7 buzzer beater shot to send them on to the next round. So, truly a heartbreaking loss. I mean, it's certainly a series that could have gone either way. But, it didn't. The ball didn't bounce their way. And I think Toronto was probably the better team. So I think that makes sense. Moving on to the bubble season, that was a total disaster year. That was, the previous offseason, they made the horrible decision to sign Al Horford, who I love dearly, but good God, that was a horrible basketball fit outside of next to Joel Embiid, rather. That was when Elton Brand was still in charge of the front office, so feels kind of like a lifetime ago. But anyway, in that 2020 bubble season, they got swept by the Celtics. Ben Simmons was hurt. It was kind of a wash of a season. In 2021... this was far and away the worst playoff shortcomings. That was, they were the number 1 seed that season. Ben Simmons definitely had the best regular season of his career, I would argue. And they ended up losing to the Hawks in the second round. And so this was not your average loss in the second round because, again, they were the 1 seed. They lost to the Hawks, who were the 5 seed. And this was like the Ben Simmons meltdown season. They ended up losing in 7 games. Ben Simmons did the famous, he passed up a dunk in what I would imagine, looking back, was probably that game 7, when only Trae Young was relatively in the vicinity. 7 foot tall Ben Simmons just passed up an open dunk. It was really embarrassing. And that basically led to him sitting out the entire next season. And so that was horrible. That Atlanta series, as much as it was talked about, I don't think it gets talked about enough. There's no business. Philly had no business losing to that Hawks team as they were, currently constructed. So that was really, really bad. And then last season, they, finally ended the Ben Simmons saga at the trade deadline by moving him to Brooklyn and acquiring James Harden, which was a fantastic deal. That's aged really well for Philly, obviously. But however, when they acquired Harden last season, his start to the Philly tenure was pretty rocky. He was out of shape because he had basically quit on his second team in 12 months. And so, the start, the initial period of having Harden in Philly certainly wasn't great. And so they ended up losing to Miami in round 2. Again, how quickly we forget that Miami was a 1 seed last season. So, Miami had home court, but most importantly, Harden wasn't playing great, and Embiid got banged up. I want to say he broke his nose or something like that. That's when he was playing, or at least he broke a bone in his face and was playing with a mask. And I think he had a lower body injury too. So he was really banged up last season, and people kind of gave him a pass. And so, again, looking back on that, that run right there, the only, really unforgiving loss that they have is the 2021 loss to Atlanta. But again, it's there's always something. As this is kind of the theme of this episode, is that injuries happen and, the ball bounces a certain way and whatever, and it results in a series loss. But, the great teams find a way to overcome that. And Philly is not a great team. Or they haven't been proven to be a great team in the past 5 years or so. But here we are today, right? They had the 2 seed a couple weeks ago. Now they're back, or I want to say about a week ago they were the 2 seed in the East, and now Boston has passed them again. And now they are at the 3 seed in the East. But you look at this Philly team, and this is about as good of a chance as they've had in the past 5 years, I would argue. They were obviously really good that Jimmy Butler season, but right now Joel Embiid is on the cusp of maybe finally getting that NBA MVP. We'll see which way that goes. They have the highest winning percentage in the NBA since December 1st, which is pretty incredible. I didn't even realize that to be the case. So they've been on fire this, basically the last 2/3 of the season. They've been arguably the best team in basketball. And, they're pretty healthy. They're pretty healthy right now. You'll never get a better Embiid season than this. I think at best he can, probably plateau at this level. But if Philly wants to avoid disaster, they need to make it to the Eastern Conference Finals. Now, yes, I do not think that they're going to get there. I do not think they're going to beat a Boston or Milwaukee, either one of those teams, to get to there. But if they want to avoid the pressure volcano that they're going to suffer if they fall short of their goals. Like they need to make it to an Eastern Conference Finals. Like, you could say that playoff success is important and it's something that gets taken into account when you look at these MVPs. Well, Embiid virtually has none of it. And I think that it needs to be Philly's year. I don't think it's going to be, but I think it needs to be. And they're in a tough situation, and that's why I put them that high on the list. That's why they are my second team. Moving on to my final team, the team that I would say has the most pressure on it to perform in this late regular season and 2023 NBA playoffs is the Denver Nuggets. Now, I've been on the record on this podcast of basically being a Denver believer. I really appreciate what Jokic has done. Of course, who hasn't? You might win 3 consecutive MVPs. But I really like the surrounding pieces on this team. I think, despite their moves at the trade deadline not exactly paying dividends yet, I think there's still time for that to take place before the end of the season here. But Denver's had some success. Honestly, they had more playoff success than I kind of thought. Just looking back at their recent history, they kind of jumped on the scene in the 2018-19 season where they lost, in round 2 of the playoffs to Portland. That was a really crazy 7-game series against Portland, where actually, again, it went 7 games, and one of the games that Denver lost was a quadruple overtime loss, which is pretty nuts. Again, people, who really cares about that series? Like, they were just, fighting to just lose and get killed. Like, whoever won that series was going to get killed by Golden State, and eventually Portland did. And it wouldn't have been any different if Denver made it. But I thought it was crazy how close they got to be making a Western Conference Finals that far back. In the bubble, the 2020 season, they actually did make it to the Western Conference Finals. They got crushed by a much better Laker team, but they did make the most out of the bubble experience. That's where we certainly saw Jamal Murray hit his, peak, if you will, his peak of his young career, where he was consistently playing his best basketball. The following season, which was 2 years ago, the 2021 season, they were swept by Phoenix in round 2. Jamal Murray got hurt, I want to say, in that series or maybe the series before. That's when he tore his ACL. And so it was really no surprise that they lost to Phoenix. They were probably going to lose to Phoenix anyway. And then last year, I feel like they caught a lot of slack. Maybe it was just because, again, Jokic had just won his second MVP, but they ended up losing in round 2 to Golden State last year, which, again, in the moment they took a lot of slack, but looking back, it's like, yeah, no shit. They lost to the best team in basketball, and they were missing, Michael Porter Jr. and Jamal Murray. They're, third and second best players, respectively. So it is pretty interesting that, they took some slack for that. But the reason why I feel like there's so much pressure on Denver is, really the career that Jokic is building for himself, like the fact that whether he gets the 3rd MVP in a row or not, it doesn't really matter. There's already so much pressure on that team. If he does get that MVP, he'll be joining Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, and Larry Bird as the only other 3 players in NBA history to win 3 consecutive MVPs, which, as you would expect, is insanely impressive. But I just feel like the stars are aligning for them. If you zoom out and you look at the Western Conference, moving forward, I think a team like Golden State is going to be back in the mix next year. I think Phoenix, again, assuming they're healthy, is still going to have at least one more year of being really competitive, regardless of what happens with Chris Paul, because I think Kevin Durant and Devin Booker are that good. I think a team, like the Clippers, like they could have a chance at next year. I think the Lakers are much better constructed if they, go into next year with the roster that they currently have instead of the roster that they had to start the season. Like, I think I could see a lot of growth for a lot of teams in the Western Conference is what I'm trying to say. Really, except for Denver. I think they could be just as good as what they are right now, but the stars are aligning for them, again, right now. Like, they are the healthiest team in the Western Conference. Out of the teams that I think could actually win the whole thing. Like, again, I know that, Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. are still kind of up and down, but you've had those guys all season. You really can't make the injury excuse anymore. Like, it's a long season, and, you've had them for 80 games now. You have to, nearly 80 games now. That being said, like, I think for the Denver Nuggets, they need to make it to the finals. I think that this is the year where they need to capitalize. At the very least, maybe if they make it to the Western Conference Finals and lose to Phoenix, that'll be enough for people. But, Jokic is putting a target on his back by being so damn good and winning so many MVPs that they are facing a maximum amount of pressure. And I think if you're the Denver Nuggets, you need to look yourself in the mirror and be like, this is our opportunity. That's ultimately why I ended up settling on them, facing more pressure than Philly is because in my heart, I do not believe that Philly can win a title. I do believe that Denver can. I think it's unlikely. I still think, the title is going to come from the Eastern Conference. It's going to be Milwaukee or Boston. But I do think that Denver needs to make it out of the Western Conference to, reach their goals this season and to avoid, a shitload of negative media attention, a shitload of turmoil. And it's just going to be a really long offseason for Denver if they do not make it to the NBA Finals. So with that, let me just zoom out and kind of go through my list again, just to focus on some teams that, non-contending teams that have a lot of pressure heading into the end of the regular season. I had the Timberwolves and the Raptors. My number 6 team / honorable mention was the Grizzlies. Number 5, I had the Clippers, who, again, kind of caught a break because Paul George is hurt again, but what else is new? Number 4, I have Boston. Number 3, I have Phoenix. Number 2 is Philly, and the team with the most pressure heading into the playoffs is the Denver Nuggets. I think with that, again, this is kind of a unique idea. Maybe I'll probably bum myself out if I Google this shit, Google NBA pressure pyramid at the end of this, and I'll find out that there's 15 pods just like this that already done it, and then I'll be bummed. But whatever. I'm going to assume right now that ignorance is bliss, and I thought of this idea on my own, and hopefully it's a pretty cool concept that you guys enjoy. Maybe I'll get in my graphic design bag after this episode is posted in a couple days, and I can make a graphic of this pressure pyramid and share it to get those much needed social engagement clicks. We love those clicks. And we also love reviews. We love sharing the show. Be sure to follow the show everywhere at Words with Wallace. Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Be sure to, again, like the show, follow the show, share the show, tell a friend. And we will be coming at you next week. Again, next week, it'll be, we're essentially exactly 2 weeks away from the end of the season like I was talking about. So I'm not exactly sure what I'll do next week. I'm sure there'll be some other storylines for me to touch on. I don't think I'll get into the award stuff yet, or I don't think I'll get into playoff matchups yet since that'll still be up in the air. So we'll see. A little TBD on next week's episode. Maybe we can be flexible with that. If you guys have any ideas for that, let me know. But with that, I'm going to hit this button and get up out of here. You guys have a great rest of your week, and I will talk to you later.